They say rules keep order, but compassion keeps humanity alive. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on battlefields, but in quiet hospital corridors, where one choice can define whether a person is forgotten or remembered. This is not just a story about a nurse and a veteran. It is about courage, dignity, and the cost of doing what is right when the system says no. So lean in, listen closely, and let your heart decide. When faced with rules versus humanity, which one would you choose? If you believe compassion should never be punished, follow this channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this story so more people remember what true honor looks like. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the hospital's tall glass windows, casting pale squares of light across the waiting chairs in Riverside General's emergency lobby. It was a Wednesday like any other, the kind of day that blurred into the dozens before it. Nurses hurried between triage rooms, doctors spoke in clipped tones over charts, and patients sat with expressions that ranged from impatience to despair. Among the steady hum of hospital life, a figure appeared at the entrance, thin, sunburned, and limping. His jeans were torn along one leg, and the denim was stiff with dried blood. The man's name, written on a battered ID card dangling from his pocket, was Walter Briggs. His keychain bore a set of dented dog tags, the letters U.S. Army faint but still visible beneath years of wear. He walked unevenly, dragging his right leg until he stopped in front of the reception desk. His calf carried an angry gash, the wound swollen, infected, and red with spreading heat. He leaned heavily on the counter as though the building itself might keep him upright. The receptionist looked up briefly, her eyes cold with routine efficiency. "Insurance?" she asked flatly, tapping at her keyboard without looking closer at the wound. "No, ma'am," Walter admitted, his voice low, almost apologetic. The woman pursed her lips, muttering under her breath as she glanced around the lobby. "We can't admit him," she called toward a nearby nurse. "Why, not in the system." Claire Morgan, standing not far away, heard every word. At 36, she had worked in Riverside General for nearly 11 years, the kind of nurse who addressed every patient with respect. "Sir, ma'am," whether they wore polished shoes or tattered boots. Her instincts reacted before her mind did. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing at the infected wound. "That doesn't mean he doesn't need help," Claire said firmly. The charge nurse frowned, already uneasy. "Claire, you know the rules. We can't admit him without insurance. Liability issues, procedures." "Then I'll treat him off the system," Claire replied without hesitation. Her voice carried a steadiness that silenced the protest around her. She reached for a med kit, motioning for Walter to sit down quietly at the corner of the lobby. Most of the staff chose not to interfere. A few glanced away, pretending not to notice. Claire crouched by the veteran, her hands moving with practiced calm as she unpacked gauze, antiseptic, and a small vial of antibiotics. Walter winced as she cleaned the gash, his jaw tightening with each sting. Still he sat still, his posture that of a man trained to endure far worse. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't want to be a burden." Claire paused, meeting his eyes. They were dry, steady, but behind them lay deserts, dust, and battles fought long before she ever laid eyes on him. With a small, steady smile, she whispered, "You fought for this country. Let someone fight for you now." Walter blinked, his throat tightening, though no tears fell. "Thank you," he murmured, as if the words themselves carried weight heavier than his tired body. She worked carefully, methodically, flushing out infection, applying a clean bandage, and finally slipping him a small packet of antibiotics. From her lunch bag, she pulled a granola bar, pressing it into his palm. "Eat this, it'll help." Walter looked down at the simple gift as if it were more precious than gold. "You didn't see me," Claire added softly, glancing toward the reception desk. "But you're not walking out of here limping." When he finally stood, the bandage tight against his wound, his steps were steadier. He nodded once silently before turning toward the doors. The dog tags clinked faintly against his keys as he disappeared into the sunlight. The moment passed quickly, swallowed by the rhythm of hospital duties, but the weight of it lingered in Claire's chest. She knew she had crossed a line, rules had been broken, protocol ignored. Yet when she thought of Walter's quiet words, "Thank you, ma'am," there was no regret, only a quiet certainty that she had done what was right. The next morning, her certainty was tested. Claire received a call to report to administration. The director's office was stark, cold, and impersonal, its walls lined with framed certificates instead of warmth. Behind the desk sat Administrator Richard Hale, a man whose tie was always perfectly knotted and whose loyalty was pledged more to policy than to people. "You violated hospital procedure," he said, his voice clipped. "Unauthorized medication, unauthorized treatment, no chart, no paperwork." Claire stood tall, her shoulders squared, though her pulse beat fast. "I helped a man who served this country, a man who needed care. That's what I've done every day for the past 11 years. "This is not up for debate," Hale replied curtly. "You are suspended pending review." The words fell like a gavel in a courtroom. There was no hearing, no warning, no attempt at understanding, just a punishment handed down like a sentence. Claire felt her throat tighten but refused to plead. She nodded once, collected her badge, and turned toward the door. The hallway outside felt colder with every step. Nurses looked up as she passed, some with sympathy, others with avoidance. At her locker, she packed in silence, a decade of service folded into a box in less than 10 minutes. She carried her coat and purse, but no badge, no goodbyes. Outside, the sun blazed too bright, as though mocking the weight pressing down on her chest. She slid into her car, her hands trembling against the steering wheel. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and in the silence, she whispered aloud, "I'd do it again." The memory of Walter's voice echoed back. "Thank you, ma'am." She repeated it to herself as she drove home through familiar streets that now seemed foreign, like a landscape stripped of meaning. At her kitchen table, she stacked her old nursing textbooks, their pages filled with rules and procedures. None of them had prepared her for the moment when a human life demanded action, regardless of regulation. She brewed tea, but it cooled untouched on the table. That evening, her phone buzzed with messages. Some colleagues sent quiet words of support. Most remained silent. Then, hours later, a headline appeared online. "Nurse suspended for helping a veteran." Comments flooded in, some furious, some tearful. "Policy over people. This is why we lose good nurses. My father served and was treated like trash. God bless that nurse." If this is true, that hospital should be ashamed. Claire sat on her porch, the glow of her phone reflecting against her pale face. She tried not to cry, but her chest felt heavy with every new notification. Among the flood of voices, one message stood out. It read simply, "He told me what you did. You don't know me, but I know him. I'm coming. No name, no number. Just that." Claire set the phone down, staring into the darkness beyond her porch light. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but deep in her heart, she knew one thing had not changed. She would always choose compassion, no matter the cost. The silence in Claire's kitchen the following morning was broken only by the sharp buzz of her phone alarm. She rose slowly, her body moving as though weighted down by something invisible. Habit guided her steps. Shower, coffee, a glance at the clock. Yet the motions felt hollow without the uniform folded neatly on her bed, without the badge she had surrendered the day before. When she opened her front door to fetch the mail, the world outside appeared unchanged. Children rode bicycles down the block. Sprinklers hissed on lawns, and neighbors waved politely. Yet for Claire, everything had shifted. The career she had poured her heart into for over a decade was suspended with a single decision. And no matter how she tried to steady herself, the memory of Walter Briggs' grateful eyes clung to her like a shadow she could not shake. By midday, her phone vibrated with a new message from a former colleague. "They're talking about you in the staff lounge." Another text soon followed. "It's on the news feeds now." Claire blinked, confused, until she tapped open her phone's browser. A headline scrolled across the screen in bold letters. "Nurse suspended after treating veteran without insurance." The article carried no photo of her, only a vague description, but her name, Claire Morgan, was there in black and white. The comment section beneath the story was alive with emotion. "This country is broken if helping a veteran is a crime. My brother served 2 tours and came home with nothing. Thank you to that nurse, whoever she is." Hospital administrators care more about paperwork than people. Policy exists for a reason. She knew the rules. Suspension was correct. Claire scrolled, her heart caught between despair and disbelief. She had expected silence, maybe a few whispers among colleagues. She had not expected thousands of strangers to weigh in on a moment that, to her, had felt so private and human. By evening, the attention spread to social media. A photograph circulated, Walter Briggs's dog tags resting on a hospital form, snapped by someone who had glimpsed him in the ER lobby. Posts multiplied. Veteran turned away for lack of insurance. Nurse risked career for compassion. Supporters began tagging veteran advocacy groups, demanding accountability. Claire's phone did not stop buzzing. Some messages came from coworkers who whispered solidarity. You did what we all wish we had the courage to do. Others kept their distance, worried about being linked to her decision. Among the flood were strangers, veterans she had never met. My father was a Marine. He never got the care he deserved. Bless you. I've been in Walter's shoes. Thank you for standing up for us. One message, however, unsettled her more than all the others. It read, he told me what you did. You don't know me, but I know him. I'm coming. No signature, no number, just those words. Claire set her phone aside, pressing her palm against her chest. She wasn't sure whether to feel anxious or relieved. Whoever had written it clearly knew Walter, and that meant her small act of defiance was no longer contained to Riverside General. Inside the hospital, Administrator Richard Hale sat at his polished desk, reviewing reports with irritation carved into his features. The storm brewing online had already reached his inbox in the form of forwarded articles and clipped messages from the hospital's board. He sipped coffee and muttered under his breath. This isn't about veterans, he said to the managers gathered around the table that evening. His voice was sharp, clipped, as if the very mention of compassion offended him. This is about structure, liability, order. If we let one nurse disregard procedure, then every nurse will think they can do the same. A young supervisor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But sir, the man was a veteran. He needed care. Shouldn't— Enough, Hale interrupted, his hands slamming against the table. Compassion doesn't keep this hospital safe from lawsuits. Rules do. The room fell silent, though eyes darted to one another. Not everyone agreed, but fear of reprisal kept their voices muted. Outside of administration, however, the mood among staff began to shift. Nurses whispered in corridors, their breaks lasting longer than usual. Some deliberately slowed paperwork. A quiet rebellion stirred, the kind that wasn't announced but was deeply felt. One resident pinned a small American flag to his coat in silent protest, ignoring dress code. Another scrawled a note and taped it to the staff lounge door. Compassion is not a policy violation. Hale noticed. He noticed everything, and it infuriated him. Meanwhile, Claire remained at home, watching her world unfold through screens. On her porch one evening, a neighbor knocked softly. Mrs. Larkin, a retired history teacher with silver hair pinned neatly back, carried a casserole dish. My husband served in Korea, she said, her voice trembling slightly. When he came home broken, bruised, someone like you didn't ask about paperwork either. I wanted to thank you. Claire accepted the dish, her throat tightening. For the first time since her suspension, tears spilled down her cheeks. She had not expected gratitude from the community. She had expected only silence. The gratitude, however, was not universal. Alongside praise, Claire also faced harsh criticism online. She broke the law. Hospitals can't just hand out medicine like candy. She put everyone at risk. The words stung, even if she tried to ignore them. Yet no amount of criticism could silence the growing roar of support. Veteran groups began calling the hospital switchboard, asking pointedly, "Is it true you turned away a veteran in need?" Receptionists fumbled for answers, offering scripted lines that satisfied no one. Claire's voicemail overflowed with messages. Some were from journalists hungry for a statement. Others were from private clinics extending job offers. We saw what you did. We'd be proud to have you. She listened in stunned silence, unable to decide whether to laugh or cry. At Riverside General, Hale's stress deepened. His phone rang late into the night. On one occasion, it was the chairman of the hospital board himself. The story's everywhere, Rick, the chairman said, voice heavy with pressure. Veteran groups are organizing. A congressman's aide just called me. She broke protocol, Hale insisted, his jaw tightening. This is black and white. Sometimes, the chairman replied evenly, black and white needs reviewing. Fix this before it breaks us. Sleep eluded Hale that night. He drafted a carefully worded statement by dawn, cold in tone, but laced with vague promises. It defended Claire's suspension while suggesting a future review of emergency care policies for veterans. It was neither an apology nor an admission, and when released, it satisfied no one. By then, the story had grown beyond hospital walls. Posts on social media reached tens of thousands. Hashtags trended. Veterans in neighboring towns gathered outside Riverside General with signs that read, "Honor our heroes in compassion before policy." Claire watched it unfold, stunned at how quickly her quiet act in a corner of the ER had become a movement. Each night she sat on her porch, phone in hand, heart aching between fear and gratitude. She had wanted only to help one man walk without pain. Now it seemed she had sparked a fire that could no longer be contained. And in the shadows of this storm, the mysterious message she had received lingered in her mind. "I'm coming." She did not yet know that the man who wrote those words wore 4 silver stars on his shoulders, and that his arrival would change everything. If you believe small acts of courage can ripple into something greater, stay with this story, because what began as one nurse's quiet choice was about to erupt into a moment that no one in Riverside General would ever forget. The hospital lobby was unusually quiet at dawn. A few staff shuffled in with coffee cups, while overnight patients dozed in chairs. Then the elevator chimed, its sound echoing through the sterile air. The door slid open, revealing a tall figure in a pressed uniform, the silver glint of 4 stars gleaming from his shoulder boards. The security guard at the front desk froze mid-sentence. His posture straightened automatically. Instinct born of recognition. "Can I help you, sir?" The man didn't glance at him. His gaze was direct, his steps purposeful. "I'm looking for Nurse Claire Morgan." Word spread through the building like fire, leaping across dry grass. Within minutes, phones were lifted, screens lit, and whispers raced down hallways. Staff abandoned their stations for doorways and corners, straining to catch a glimpse. A 4-star general had just walked into Riverside General, and he was asking for the suspended nurse. Upstairs, Administrator Richard Hale's assistant burst into his office, breathless. "Sir, you need to come. There's someone here." "Who?" Hale snapped, irritation masking the flicker of unease in his chest. "A general," the assistant whispered. "With stars, 4 of them." Hale's hand tightened around his pen. He adjusted his tie, grabbed his jacket, and marched toward the lobby with feigned confidence. By the time he arrived, a crowd had already gathered. The general stood at the center, tall, calm, and immovable, his presence commanding without effort. "General," Hale said, voice too polished, too quick. "May I ask what this is regarding?" The man turned, his expression controlled but his eyes unwavering. "My name is General Thomas Avery," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the lobby. "And I served with the man your nurse helped." A murmur rippled through the gathered staff. General Avery continued, his tone steady yet heavy with memory. "Walter Briggs saved my life in Kandahar. Twice. When I was bleeding out behind a burning convoy, he didn't ask me for a policy number. He didn't wait for paperwork. He ran into fire without a helmet, without armor, because duty demanded it." His words cut through the sterile quiet, leaving no room for doubt. Every nurse, every patient, every administrator listening felt the weight of his testimony. "Your nurse," Avery said, turning back toward Hale, "offered him antibiotics and dignity. And your hospital punished her for it." Hale swallowed, his throat dry. "General, with respect, this is highly irregular." "So is punishing compassion," Avery interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding. From his inner pocket, he withdrew a sealed envelope and held it aloft. "This letter is already on its way to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs." He pulled out a smaller one, thinner, marked with a handwritten name. "And this one is for Nurse Claire Morgan." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Hale shifted uncomfortably, but the general's focus had already moved elsewhere. "Where is she?" Avery asked. A young nurse at the station hesitated, then spoke softly. "She's outside, sir, sitting on the front curb." Without another word, Avery turned and strode through the automatic doors. Outside, Claire sat on the concrete edge of the sidewalk, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She looked up as Boots stopped in front of her. For a heartbeat, she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. The man towering above her brought with him an aura that seemed to carry the weight of nations. He raised his hand in a formal salute. Corman Morgan, he said with deliberate gravity. Permission to thank you properly. Claire scrambled to her feet, flustered. I'm not military, sir, she murmured. No, Avery replied, lowering his hand, but you remembered what we fight for. He handed her the envelope. She accepted it hesitantly, fingers trembling against the paper. Inside were two documents, an invitation to speak at the National Medical Ethics Summit and a formal job offer from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Regional Emergency Response Liaison. Reporters, already drawn by the online storm, had begun to gather at the hospital's entrance. Cameras lifted, microphones extended, yet Claire said nothing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the doors behind Avery, the same doors where her career had been stripped away. Will they change? She asked softly. Only if someone like you walks back in, Avery replied. Inside, Administrator Hale stood by the nurses' station, watching through the glass. His confidence cracked under the general's authority. He knew the hospital's mission statement, healing with integrity, etched into the lobby wall, now mocked him. Every eye in the building was fixed not on him, but on the man who spoke with lived conviction. The general turned back toward the lobby, his voice carrying across the crowded space. Walter Briggs came home from 3 tours with more shrapnel in his body than most museums hold on display. He never asked for praise, never sought recognition. And when infection nearly took him, he endured 5 days before walking into this hospital. He didn't ask for charity, he asked for help. Claire clutched the envelope, her chest tight. I don't understand, she whispered. Why all this for me? General Avery's sternness softened. Because this isn't just about you. This happens everywhere. Good people punished for doing the right thing. Someone had to draw the line. You did. The crowd hushed, every ear strained for what came next. Hale stepped forward at last, voice quivering, though he tried to project control. General Avery, may I speak with you privately? No, sir, Avery said, his reply crisp and audible to all. If you have something to say it here. A tense silence followed. Hale's gaze lifted toward the mission statement again. Its words cut him like glass. Finally, he turned toward Claire. Nurse Morgan, he said loudly, your suspension is rescinded. There was scattered applause from staff, tentative at first, then stronger, but Avery raised a hand, silencing it. Lifting a punishment is not the same as admitting it never should have happened, he said firmly. Hale's voice cracked. What would you have me do? Start, Avery replied, by admitting the failure wasn't hers. It was a system that forgot its purpose. The air thickened with expectation. Staff leaned forward. Patients craned their necks. Even those outside on the sidewalk waited. Breath held. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a familiar figure emerged. Walter Briggs. His limp was gone, the infection healed. He walked slowly, steadily, until he stood beside Claire. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a rebuke stronger than any speech. Hale looked between them, the general, the veteran, the nurse. For the first time in his 23 years of administration, the institution he had defended felt smaller than the people standing in front of him. I apologize, he said finally, his voice trembling. To both of you, I lost sight of what mattered. The apology hung in the air, fragile but real. Whether it would be enough remained uncertain. What was certain was that nothing in Riverside General would ever be the same again. The crowd in the hospital courtyard lingered long after the general's words faded. Nurses, patients, even passers-by from the street seemed unwilling to move, as though they were witnessing something larger than a workplace dispute. Claire stood still, the envelope in her hand, her mind whirling with disbelief. Hours earlier, she had been suspended, silenced, discarded. Now she stood in the center of a storm that was reshaping not just her life, but the institution she had once trusted. Walter Briggs remained beside her, his quiet strength saying more than speeches ever could. For years, he had endured without complaint. Scars of war hidden beneath clothes, wounds healed by sheer will. But his presence now was a statement. He had survived battlefields, and he was willing to stand with the nurse who had refused to let him walk away untreated. Inside, Administrator Hale felt the walls of his authority tremble. He had built his career on policies, protocols, and a rigid belief that order outweighed exceptions. Yet faced with the living embodiment of sacrifice, a decorated general, a wounded veteran, and the nurse who had defied him, his arguments sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I apologize," he had said, and though the words were true, he knew they were not enough. Something deeper had been broken, something that would not be mended by rescinding a suspension. The following weeks unfolded like an unstoppable tide. A plaque appeared near the emergency room entrance, polished brass engraved with simple words, "For those who act with compassion before protocol." It bore no names, but every staff member knew who had inspired it. Patients paused to read it as they entered, and for many veterans, it was the first time they felt recognized not as cases but as people. Claire returned to Riverside General, but not to her old role. She was offered a new position, Veteran Care Liaison, created specifically for her. Her office was modest, converted from a supply closet, but its purpose carried weight. Nurses and doctors began seeking her out, asking questions about how to handle veterans without insurance, or how to balance rules with real human need. Claire answered each inquiry with the same calm certainty she had carried that day with Walter Briggs. Every Thursday, Walter visited. He never came empty-handed. Sometimes it was a cup of coffee, other times a small flag he would set gently on the reception desk. He never made speeches, never sought attention. He simply sat with Claire for a few minutes, a quiet ritual that became part of the hospital's rhythm. One afternoon, a young nurse whispered to him, wide-eyed, "Is that her? The woman from the story?" Walter didn't look up from stirring his coffee. "She's not a story," he replied. "She's a reminder." The story did not stay confined to Riverside. Other hospitals took notice, their boards convening emergency meetings to review policies. Veteran groups amplified the movement, pressing lawmakers to act. Within months, a state senator introduced the Claire Morgan Act, legislation requiring emergency care for veterans regardless of insurance status. For the first time, Claire realized her small act of defiance had sparked change far beyond the walls where it began. Inside the hospital network, shifts occurred quietly but decisively. 6 facilities adopted new veteran protocols. Staff training incorporated not only medical procedure, but also ethical discretion. The phrase compassion before protocol became a guiding principle whispered in hallways and posted in break rooms. As for Administrator Hale, he was reassigned away from direct policymaking. Though he never publicly admitted defeat, those who knew him sensed that the confrontation with General Avery had left a mark. In quieter moments, he was seen staring at the mission statement etched in glass, as if still reckoning with how far he had strayed from its meaning. Claire carried her new role with humility. She avoided interviews, declined media requests, and never boasted about her story. Instead, she walked the halls with quiet purpose, her new badge displaying 2 names: Northgate Medical on one side, Department of Veterans Affairs on the other. The dual identity was not symbolic. It was practical, bridging a gap that had too long been ignored. One rainy Tuesday, exactly 4 months after Walter had first limped into the ER, a package arrived on Claire's desk. Inside, cushioned by tissue paper, lay her old Riverside badge, framed alongside a handwritten note. "Some rules are meant to be broken. Thank you for knowing which ones." The handwriting was unmistakable. General Avery. Claire's eyes blurred as she traced the frame with her fingers. She placed it on her office shelf, a reminder not of her suspension, but of the moment she had chosen people over procedure. That same afternoon, a resident hurried into her office. He looked nervous, his words tumbling over themselves. "I've got a Marine in room 7. No insurance. VA is 2 hours away. Protocol says transfer, but he's not stable." Claire regarded him for a long moment. She could see in his eyes the same conflict she had once faced. Fear of consequences warring with instinct. "What does your instinct say?" she asked gently. The resident hesitated, then swallowed. "Treat him now." Claire's smile was calm, steady, the same one she had given Walter Briggs. "Then you already know what to do." He shifted on his feet. "But what if I get in trouble?" Claire turned back toward her desk, her voice carrying across the room with a certainty that seemed to steady the very walls. "Then I'll call the general." The words hung in the air like a promise, firm and unshakable. From that day forward, Riverside General was never again just a hospital. It became a place where rules were tempered with humanity, where veterans were greeted not with suspicion about their insurance, but with recognition of their sacrifice. And Claire Morgan, once a nurse punished for breaking protocol, became a figure whispered about with respect, not because she sought fame, but because she reminded everyone what medicine was meant to be. The story of Walter Briggs, General Avery, and Claire Morgan spread beyond state lines, picked up by veteran groups, civic organizations, even schools. Teachers read excerpts in classrooms as examples of moral courage. Legislators cited the case during debates about healthcare reform. In a world often numbed by bureaucracy, it stood out as proof that one quiet act could still shake the walls of institutions. Claire never sought to be a hero. She saw herself simply as a nurse doing what was right. But heroes rarely name themselves. They are named by those whose lives they touch. And every time Walter Briggs set a small flag on the front desk, every time a veteran walked through the ER doors and saw the plaque that read, "You're not forgotten. You're not alone." Welcome home, Claire's heart understood the truth. The cost of compassion might be high, but the reward was immeasurable. If you believe quiet courage still changes the world, let this story live beyond these words. Share it, reflect on it, and honor those who choose right over rules, because that is what true integrity looks like.